Welcome to the Roomie Review. I'm your host, Sophie, and I'm so excited because this is our very first episode. So I just want to start off this whole series by giving you a quick preview of what we will be talking about here as a podcast. So I'm a current college student studying communications, and I just thought that I could use what I'm learning in the classroom to be a resource. So on here, we will be discussing anything and everything that has to do with roommates and how we communicate interpersonally. I'll be discussing different theories within the field of communications, pulling from various textbooks and sources that I have felt helpful in their explanations. But the best part of this is that it's all through the Christian lens. So after every episode, we will be bringing it back to the Bible. I will be pulling in different verses that I found that are related to communications and how we can use that to glorify God. So, but also you can expect some very special guests along the way, some of which are my own roommates, and those episodes will be later on. But this first one, you'll just be with me, just kind of going through what we'll be covering on here, and then covering interpersonal communication specifically, just in a very broad sense of sort of like an introduction. But my hope for this whole podcast series is for you just to feel like, you're within the conversation, just like a fly on the wall, listening in, and just like we're just best friends. And so I just wanted to start it off like that. But like I said, today we'll be discussing about interpersonal communication in relation to roommates. So, and I'm going to kind of go into three main points with that. So we're going to start with how does it apply to us? Like, why are we looking over this type of communication? How does it apply to roommates? Why does it matter for us to study it? And then lastly, how do we apply this knowledge? So first of all, how does it apply to us? So we communicate with everybody, and we're talking, keep this in mind, we're speaking about roommates. So how does it apply to your relationship with your roommate? So you're gonna obviously talk to them, you're living with them, you're in the same room with them, and that's communication through eye contact, obviously speaking to them verbally, your body language, anything. So any kind of like signals that you give back and forth between two people, that is communication. And so that just shows just how many types of communication there really is, and you can just kind of become aware of how much we actually do communicate with each other, whether that's intentional or not. And so starting off, I just have a quick definition of communication from a great resource that I found through one of my communication classes I'm taking right now. Like I said, communications is my major, so I'm actually taking two classes in that right now. So as I'm learning, I'm just kind of processing through this podcast and just sharing with you all what I'm learning. So the definition of communication, here we go. The relational process of creating and interpreting messages that elicit a response. And this is from Griffin's book called A First Look of Communication Theory. And this book is just an awesome resource because it just breaks down these certain communication theories and then just shows how much it applies in your actual life. And this has been so helpful to me. But then, like I said, so interpersonal communication, which is a more specific type, interpersonal meaning within relationships, within roommate relationships, like we're talking about here, is the verbal and nonverbal interaction between two interdependent people. So those two different definitions for communication and interpersonal communication, very similar. And that last one for interpersonal communication is from DeVito's book that specifically talks about interpersonal communication. It's actually just called the Interpersonal Communication book. Pretty straightforward. But as roommates, we are completely interdependent on the other. You're living together, you're in a fairly small space, depending on, what college you go to. Some state schools, those rooms can get really tiny. Other colleges are more generous with their room sizes, but yet again, you're with each other a lot, whether you're friends or more acquaintances that you just kind of, put up with. Let's be honest, some roommates don't always get together. Me personally, I have loved my roommates. We've all become really close friends, but we are together a lot. We get meals together. We're also on the volleyball program at my school, and so we have practices. We are together a lot, but we also love being together. We hang out, but that also calls for us to have good communication skills. And I have found that so quickly and so clearly that communication is so important to understand each other's schedules and to really see how each other are feeling. So yeah, I'm going to go into the second point. Why does it matter? Why does it matter? So like I said, knowing schedules, knowing how we're feeling, it helps form our relationships in a healthy way. So we all kind of know what each other is thinking, what each other is feeling. And you can find this better and you can find this quicker in the effectiveness of your communication. And that's in also, DeVito covered that in his book, the Interpersonal Communication book, direct title. But the effectiveness of your communication, so you need to remember just how deliberate you're being with what you're saying, but then when also you're doing, like I said, with body language, is that's a huge way for you to communicate with other people. But in addition to this, I've also found so me and my roommates, we're all American, we all have similar backgrounds, but there are little differences in what we expect socially from each other and how we communicate. But through understanding communication, we can see how it affects the culture, if that makes sense. And it can create a culture by the way that you communicate, and vice versa. The culture you grew up in affects the way you communicate. And so all of us are a little bit different in that, and I've noticed that just within the few weeks that we've started school, but we all have some different and similar social expectations. And this is even further covered within another great book that I found called Creating Culture Through Media and Communications by, and I might botch this last name, Moreira. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that was a great resource for me to find just how culture is related to the communication. And we'll talk that actually in my next episode about how when we're raised differently within different cultures, that can really affect how we communicate with other people and our expectations of communication, how we say things and how we receive things. And then lastly, just real quick, how do we apply this knowledge? So we know it's important. What do we do with it? Blake Neff specifically talked about this in a great way in his book, A Pastor's Guide to Interpersonal Communication. And it just showed the applicability of knowing how to communicate, how to do it well. And at first, you hear the title, A Pastor's Guide. Well, how does this apply to me if I'm not specifically in ministry? Well, chapter 1 specifically talked about that. Well, even just the opening chapters in general talked about the relationships between pastors and church members. And it just showed how we have specific relationships with specific people in our lives. Me and my pastor have a different relationship with, me and my sister, but that just goes to show that you have different relationships, different way of communicating within those different relationships. And so I'm not going to expect my friend to react the same way that my mom would to a different thing I'm saying, and I wouldn't expect them to have the same response to it, if that makes sense. So I'd really encourage you to maybe look into that book as a resource if you want to go into that further. But this is the same for roommate relationships too. If you're really good friends with your roommate, maybe you have a more distant relationship, they're going to take things differently. And like I said, not all roommates, you don't end up always being friends. I've heard stories of both ends. My parents had good relationships with the roommates. Sometimes they still have them as friends even after they graduated college, and sometimes you just kind of move on and you kind of aren't as close, you aren't as connected that way. But then I just wanted to, like I said, bring it back to Bible, what Scripture says about how we should communicate with each other. So Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man." And this verse has really spoken to me. It convicted me of how I really should be talking and treating people. It's really called me to be more aware of how I'm acting through my verbal, nonverbal communication, how I hold myself. And so I just think that that's a great thing to take along. I know I didn't cover too much in detail about, this was this eye-opening thing, but this is just a broad kind of introduction of what we will be covering further in the future. And speaking of that, I want to get into a little bit of what we're going to cover in next week's episode, which will be culture. Like I said, different expectations within different cultures of how we communicate. And actually having my first guest come on here and speak to that specifically, as he's had this experience firsthand, as his roommate is from a different country than he is. And I have heard some stories just maybe about some miscommunications or some fun interactions that they've had. So that'll be so exciting for having them come on here and speak more about that. But thank you so much for listening in. I hope this gave you a good taste of what will be covered on here. Maybe sparked your interest. And I hope to see you here next week. Thank you so much.